Welcome back. In the previous video we talked about aperture and shutter speed as two main components of things you need to know when you're working on a DSLR, or really any camera that has a moving shutter. So now we're going to talk about two different things you need to know aside from those. And the first is white balance. White balance is the process in which the camera's sensor, so the little computer chip in the back of the camera that absorbs light, how it adjusts and how it records some different colors. Now, this matters a lot when you're looking at the color white. White ends up being the real difference in color temperature sometimes, and so that's why it's called white balance, even though it deals with the spectrum of colors. And so this is a really good example photo of what we're talking about when we talk about white balance. White, if you remember back to your 8th grade science class, white is actually made up of all of the different colors in the light spectrum all squished together. And so it makes computers difficult sometimes. It makes the process of the computer chip absorbing white a little difficult because certain tonal aspects of the color white can be absorbed differently. And so here we have a photograph of, or 4 photographs of the exact same space at the exact same point in time at a shopping mall. It's an escalators at a shopping mall. And the white balance is different for all 4 of them. You'll notice the top left seems maybe what we would call neutral. The top right has sort of a darker tone to it, but more yellow and slightly more of a golden color. The bottom left is more of a brighter yellow, way more of a sort of high-end yellow. And then bottom right, we have almost an eerie green-blue color. Bottom right kind of looks like it should be in a zombie movie or something. But all of these are the exact same space with the exact same natural light. All that's changed is how the computer sensor in the camera is absorbing and having to replicate the color white in its final version, the picture that it's making. And just so you know, I've used this term already, but I want to make sure that we're all clear here. This ends up being lumped into the conversation about color temperature. And so if I use color temperature and white balance interchangeably sometimes, know that we're talking about a very similar aspect of the same thing here. Also, if we think back to our early days of maybe elementary school, we learned that there are hot colors and cool colors. Hot colors are red and orange and yellow, and cool colors are blue and green and gray. Colors that denote psychological aspects of how we view hot and cold. And so if we go think about a camera that is set with a white balance that is making things too warm or too hot, it's absorbing white far too in the red or yellow spectrum. If it's too cold, it's absorbing white far too in the green and blue spectrum. So we just have to keep that in mind. Now, the nice thing is that adjusting this is relatively easy. On almost every modern camera I have ever seen, there's the ability to adjust white balance, and it's just called white balance. And if you notice here on this setting, this is just a quick example, white balance is actually called color temperature in its subsection. Almost all white balance adjustments are going to have an option called AWB. Here it's on the top left of the options. AWB is automatic white balance. That means that the computer brain that lives inside your camera is going to think about what it's looking at and make an adjustment based on how bright it is and what the color temperature looks like to make it as natural as possible. The other options are symbols that represent different types of lighting. So you may have settings for full brightness. That's going to be if it is bright on a sunny day outside in full sunlight. That can make things seem too washed out, so there's too much color white. It'll adjust for that. You most likely will also have a setting for fluorescent lights, and that's if you're shooting indoors and under fluorescent lighting. That can make things appear very gray and sometimes very sort of a greenish eerie color. Tungsten lighting as well. If you're shooting indoors under tungsten lighting, that's an option to adjust because that can make things look very blue. That gives you that sort of zombie movie blue. Other options are just variations within those, like full shade, somewhat shade, and that's just adjusting how the absorption of the color white is computed within the camera itself. And so here's an example of the same place taken at the same time, or roughly the same time, in full lighting outside, looking at the different settings and how it is trying to compensate for those settings in your camera. So the daylight white, which is the full sun, we have that in the upper left. We have cloudy, we have shade, we have tungsten, we have fluorescent, and we have flash. That's if you're using the flash on the camera, it'll try to compensate for that. And you can see that they color-wise look the same, especially if you look at the comparison in the grass. Especially like the difference between the shade and the tungsten. It's trying to compensate for things that aren't there in that instance because this photograph is neither shady nor shot under tungsten lights. And so it looks unnatural. It looks, especially the one on the right there, the tungsten, kind of looks like a zombie movie. So what you want to do, just like with our aperture and our shutter speed, you want to take a lot of photos and check them out. Take some shots, look at them on your camera and see how they're looking. Try to see if things are looking too washed out, see if things are looking too green or blue, or if they're looking too golden. Just make sure that you are testing things out. And in my professional experience, the two things that will you'll find yourself in trouble with, one being fluorescent lighting, because it tends to give something sort of a grayish bluish color. It's not the best lighting in the world, but unfortunately it is everywhere, inside, indoors. Any hallway you shoot inside of any office building is probably going to be lit by fluorescent lighting. So we have to make sure our color temperature is adjusted. And the other is sodium lights. On the right is a photograph of a street light that is sodium lights. Pretty much any outdoor lighting that you'll find now is sodium lighting. It's historically been how we light the outdoors. The issue is that the way it burns a very salmony orange color. Street lights, outside floodlights, are sodium lights. And so if you don't adjust your white balance for that, if you are shooting outside at nighttime on a low aperture setting with lower speed to maybe get lots of sort of medium dark shots, everything will get a very eerie orange glow to it. Sometimes you want that, because we associate that color with streetlights. You can help set the scene that way. But if that's not what you're going for, you can end up with a really weird orange looking photograph, so you want to adjust for it that way. Also be careful, this was sort of mentioned earlier, but be careful of very bright sunny days, especially when it is high noon or sometime between 11 and 1. You're going to find that the brightness of the sun, especially here in Florida, will overload your camera's sensor, and you'll end up with something that we call hot or heat. They'll say that the color white in this photograph is blown out or looks too hot. And by that we mean that it is the boundary of the color white is expanding off of the area it's supposed to be at. So this is a picture of the sun, obviously, and you can see the streaks of white coming off of the boundaries of where the sun actually is. What you'll find is if you take a picture, let's say, of someone in a white t-shirt in the middle of the day, it almost looks like their shirt is glowing. It looks like the color white is jumping off of their shirt into the background. And that's because the white balance is set to absorb too much of the color white, and it overloads the system. So that is white balance. The next, and the last of our technical aspects for DSLRs, is ISO. I was always told that this was ISO, but then I found out that I'd been lied to my entire life, and that this isn't actually an abbreviation for anything. So I'm going to call it ISO as we continue through our conversation, because just to compensate for the fact that I was fooled for most of my life. Now, ISO is technically the sensitivity of the sensor itself, especially towards light. So if white balance is the way that it absorbs the color white and how it picks certain colors that are within white to accentuate, ISO is just simply how sensitive it is, how much of the color white or how much light itself it is taking in to the sensor. This is originally something that was sold as a component of film. So you would buy a canister of film to put in your film camera that would be marked as 200 ISO or 400 ISO or 1000 ISO. Nowadays, though, it is an adjustment of the computer sensor that has replaced the film in our cameras. And a higher ISO, so the bigger the number, means that the sensor in the camera is set to be more sensitive to light. So a higher ISO means that you can generally capture more light in dimly lit situations. So if you're shooting indoors, let's say you're shooting in a Lico arena. This is a really good example of this because inside a basketball arena or volleyball arena, the lighting is not very good and is also very far away on a very tall ceiling. So you will have to compensate for that by trying to get more light into your camera, and one of the ways to do that is by increasing the ISO, making the computer sensor in your camera more sensitive to light. But it's not magic. It's not like you can increase the number without any sort of negative whatsoever. There are going to be negatives, and that negative is what we call noise. Noise is what happens when we increase the ISO and make the sensor more sensitive to light. Yes, it will be able to take brighter photographs in the dark. The downside is you're going to have what looks like static over the photograph. It'll look like little blurry dots that break up the crisp definition of some aspects of edges and cloud flat areas of single color. So on the left, you notice there's a photograph of shot at ISO 100. On the right, at the staggeringly large ISO 3200. And if you'll notice on the right, the image has lots of tiny little dots over it. So that's our big trade-off. Every step you increase ISO and you make the sensor more sensitive to light, yes, you're going to get a brighter photograph in a darker setting, which can be crucial, but every step you go up, the more noise you're going to get on your shot. And noise is something that we have been trying to battle in digital photography for a very long time. There's software programs like Noise Ninja, this is an example of Noise Ninja, which uses an algorithm to try to smooth out noise. So on the left is the original, on the right is a photograph that has been put through the Noise Ninja filter. It tries to find the little dots, the little noise static dots, and smooth them over. There's also some very useful automatic systems within Photoshop now, and some better plugins for Photoshop that can do about the same thing. Noise Ninja is just a pretty old program, so old habits die hard. It's the one I still use. But again, it's not perfect. It's not going to make it like you shot it on a really low ISO when you didn't, but it will help smooth it out slightly. In speed, aperture, ISO, white balance, all of this stuff works together in a very powerful way to change aspects of light. It's all about light. It's all about how much light is able to enter the camera and how it is absorbed by the sensor and what used to be the film. There's a video that's sort of next in the cycle here that I want you to take a look at about how these things all work together to make a shot. It's a little bit of a longer video, but watch it. It will help. And it's not by me, it's by another photographer. But before we go and start talking about non-DSLR cameras, I just want to leave you with one final point of advice. And that is, I get asked a lot by students who take this class and find out they really like photography. I get asked a lot, what kind of camera should I buy? Should I buy a Nikon or should I buy a Canon? Should I buy one of the other types of brands? Should I buy really expensive? Should I buy when it's on sale? So here's my advice. I think that Nikon and Canon are probably your best bets to purchase, if only because they have had and maintained pretty much the same lens hookup system for multiple generations now, going back, in some cases, back to the 60s. Which means that if you buy a Nikon or Canon, you're buying the ability to retroactively take really old lenses and attach them to your camera. And because there's more lenses out there, it means that the cost of them is going to be lower, especially in the used market, and it means that the availability is going to be increased. But I also don't think you need to go immediately and drop $1 million on an expensive camera setup. Buy an entry-level camera if you can through a affordable retailer like B&H or through Amazon, and see if you like it. It's not a bad idea to physically go to a store either. I know nowadays we like to buy everything online, but fundamentally the internals, the actual way that Nikon and Canon work, are nearly identical. They use slightly different computer systems. They both take amazing photographs. Most of the difference I have found is in two things. One, how it actually feels in your hands, how the grip is, where the buttons are, the way that the eyepiece fits over your eyeball, and also the user interface of the computer system itself. If the menus are easy to access, if it's easy to adjust, or if it's different to adjust things like white balance, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, etc. So go to a store, tinker around with them, and see which one you actually like the feel of the best, and then go with that one. Now there are a world of other brands out there, and some of them are really great. There's Sony, there's Pentax, there's Olympus. I've shot on Sony cameras before, I've shot on Pentax cameras before. I actually used to really like Pentax DSLRs. And they're wonderful, they really are. And if you have one of these, I'm not trying to slight your purchase decision at all. Sony, especially now, is making leaps and bounds in the DSLR world. But if you're just brand new to this and you're getting in at the entry level, I still think it's a good idea to go with the main two, Nikon or Canon, because of the availability of used lenses. You can go out to any real small used store, pawn shop or whatever, and find an excess of available used lenses, and you know they're going to fit because they haven't changed their lens hookup in a very long time. On the topic of pawn shops, here's another good lesson. If you are really interested in getting into DSLR photography, of upper level photography, and you want to get some gear, want to get a DSLR camera, want to get some lenses, etc., before you rush off to the store, before you load up Amazon or B&H Photo and start buying stuff, do two things. One, scan Craigslist. Photography is a world that a lot of people get into, buy a lot of stuff for, realize it's not for them, and then try to get rid of it. So look on Craigslist and see if anybody's selling some old gear for a lower cost. It could also be that someone is a photographer and then has updated their camera and is selling older equipment that they don't need anymore. So Craigslist is, I have found, a really good place to look for affordable gear. Also pawn shops. Sometimes people find themselves in hard places economically, or sometimes again people decide that, you know what, photography is just not for me, I'm going to go sell all my junk to the pawn shop. They all will have good camera gear and good lenses there sometimes. So try there before you go and buy an expensive rig that is brand new. And again, this is to try to drive home the same point we started at. Remember that buying the world's most expensive camera doesn't really matter. The photographer and their skills are what makes the photograph, not the camera itself. Alright, so this concludes talking about the internals of DSLRs. So come back for the next video after taking a short break to watch the outside video, and we'll talk about point and shoot cameras.